Welcome to the NHL Wraparound podcast featuring Neil Smith, President General Manager of the 1994 Stanley Cup champion New York Rangers, and longtime ESPN NHL veteran Vic Morren. Together, they share no-nonsense opinions on news and issues around the National Hockey League. Whether you're a casual or diehard fan, each episode of NHL Wraparound will leave you more informed. Now, here's your hosts, Neil and Vic.
The off-season is upon us. Welcome to NHL Wraparound. Vic Morren, Neil Smith. We're going to be talking some free agency, some NHL Draft with our guest, Pierre LeBrun, senior columnist for the Athletic and TSN Insider. But before we do that, I think the Florida Panthers are still celebrating.
I would be if I were them. I mean, they've got good reason. They should do double the celebrating they did last year, since it's 2 in a row now, which is an amazing feat, right? It is just an amazing feat that they were able to do it 2 years in a row. Maybe I shouldn't say an amazing feat. Maybe I should say an amazing paw, since they don't have feet.
And in the midst of this, they've taken a couple of shots at the team that they defeated twice, the Edmonton Oilers, in terms of some of their celebrating and getting a few jabs in here and there.
Give us a couple of examples.
Well, I'll give you one that I read about last night, that apparently the Oilers had booked a place in Florida, a sushi place, for a celebration if they had won Game 6. So this was done prior to Game 5 when the series was 2 games apiece. And the Panthers got wind of that and I guess went there, did a whole bunch of takeout and promoted the restaurant and let everybody know that this was where the Oilers had planned to celebrate had they won, but they didn't. And so the Panthers took a little bit of advantage of that and got it out there.
Well, poor Edmonton. You know, you do have to plan these things. You do have to plan them both ways. And the players probably didn't even know about it. That's the funny part. It was probably all done by their travel guy.
How long did you celebrate for after 94? Or are you still celebrating?
Still celebrating now. It's only been 31 years.
Okay. Well, you still look almost the same. So.
Well, thank you. A lot of people think I do.
With that, we're going to transition over to 3 things you need to pay attention to, brought to you by UBS Financial Services, Inc. Number 1, UFA signings in advance of July 1st, which will, of course, come next week when free agency officially opens. But there are clubs that own their players and, needless to say, are able to sign them beforehand. So we're going to give you 4 to start with. Number 1, Trent Frederick, supposedly 8 years, $30 million at an average annual value of 3.75 AAV. However, this has been announced, but it has not been posted on either Puckpedia or on SportTrack, which are 2 of the sites which usually has very up-to-date information. So this one is not officially done yet. So you and I are still alive because we had spoken last week about who we thought that the Oilers would sign first. I said Corey Perry. You said Connor Brown. And it looks like we're still in the running on this one.
It's an odd contract, 8 years. You know he's not going to play till he's 35, especially the way he plays.
Well, let's see if he's even signed.
Yeah, but I mean, the point is that this is another one of these contracts that they're doing now in the league where there's throwaway years on it. The guy says that he wants, in this case, $30 million, and they say, well, we'll give you 30, but we're giving it to you over 8 years, not over 6, or whatever the case may be. So we'll see if he really is signed. It's bizarre that it's not out there.
Matt Duchene re-ups with Dallas, 4 years, $18 million, average annual of 4.5. He had 30 goals, 82 points last year, and has a full no-move clause for the first 2 years of this deal.
He was wonderful for Dallas this year, and when you think back to the original team that he came in with was the Colorado Avalanche, it seems like a long time ago, but boy, he's been an ever-ready bunny for the Dallas Stars.
Except in the playoffs this year where every offensive weapon that they had basically went south.
It dried up. Yep.
Eric Robinson re-ups with Carolina. The forward gets 4 years, $6.8 million, 1.7 AAV. He is 30 years old. And finally, Jonathan Toews signs a 1-year deal with the Winnipeg Jets, his hometown, $2 million with bonuses for up to $5 million more. He is 37 years old, hasn't played in 2 seasons. The contract cannot be registered until July 1st, but this is a big get. 3-time Stanley Cup winner, 2-time winner of Olympic gold. And even though he's 37, it'll be interesting to see how his body actually feels having been out of the game for 2 years and really the better part of 4 out of the last 5 because of the COVID ramifications that he suffered.
Yeah, that's right. Long haul COVID or whatever it was, but he signs in his hometown. I don't know what went on with Chicago. I read somewhere where they were disappointed that Chicago turned him down. And I don't know if that's true or not. Did you see that anywhere?
I didn't, but I'm surprised. Something interesting here, because I had posed the question to you that how can you have a bonus-laden deal and not have it count against the cap? And you'd send me a long text explaining it, that it's tied in with his age, the length of the contract, the number of games that he's played in the NHL, and the fact that he is returning from a long-term injury, which has caused him to miss over 100 NHL games.
Right. So there's your reason that it's only for players 35 and above.
Number 2, RFA signings in advance of July 1st. And these are players that are with their current clubs and will not get to free agency. Next week, Ryan Donato re-ups for 4 years, $16 million with the Chicago Blackhawks. He had a career-high 31 goals in 24-25. Matt Rempe in New York, 2-year extension, $975,000 AAV. Fabian Zetterlund, who played very well for Ottawa last year, 3 years, $12.825 million, 4.275 AAV. And then for the Dallas Stars, Nils Lundqvist and Maverick Bourque, both re-up for 1 year. Lundqvist, $1.25 million, and Bourque, $975,000. Anything intrigue you there?
I think the Zetterlund thing is intriguing because it was a good pickup, bringing him in from San Jose late in the season. 2 signings in Dallas are what they are. They're a 23-year-old in Bourque and a 24-year-old in Lundqvist. And obviously the Dallas Stars aren't completely convinced about where they sit within their roster, and that's why they went short to 1 year.
That moves us to point number 3, trades that have been made since the final. And we're going to start with Dallas and Mason Marchand, sent to Seattle for 2 draft picks, a 2025 fourth rounder and a 2026 third rounder. Enough of a return for Jim, Neil?
You know what? I think Jim was in a box. He has to shed some salary so he can get people like Jamie Benn signed and others. And probably Marchand was the guy who had to walk the plank. And he just took whatever he could get from whoever would take the contract.
Only $2.76 million in cap space for Dallas as of today. Do you like the move for Seattle?
I do. I've always liked Mason Marchand. And I don't know him in the locker room, obviously. I knew his dad, Brian, who was a longtime NHLer, but I do like his play. I do like his bite to his game, and I think he'll be missed in Dallas.
Other trades, Joe Veleno, acquired by Seattle for Andrei Burakovsky. This one sheds some good salary for the Kraken, and Veleno is a good player who I think will fit in nicely in Seattle.
Yeah, and I think Joe Veleno is a nice player that will fit in nicely. Andrei Burakovsky was a pretty high-profile name for Seattle. Not having the best year possible, but still, I think Chicago's going to take the chance that they can get out of him his max potential.
Finally, Eric Haula, forward who was with New Jersey, and he is sent to Nashville in exchange for Jeremy Hansel, a defenseman, high-end prospect, and a fourth-round pick in 2025. I thought Haula was a very serviceable player for the Devils, and I believe he's going to fit in well in Nashville. And in exchange, the Devils get a pretty good prospect and a pick.
Yeah, and it's interesting why they felt they had to trade Haula. I don't know. We haven't talked to anybody there, but I agree with you. I thought Haula was one of the guys that was pretty good player for the New Jersey Devils, but no longer. Now he joins Nashville, and we'll see if Barry Trotz can turn around this offseason from last offseason.
More moves to come, both in terms of free agency and trades as we get closer to July 1st. But for now, that will wrap up 3 things you need to pay attention to, brought to you by UBS Financial Services, Inc. Now, our discussion with Pierre LeBrun.
Now it's my pleasure to bring in an old friend of mine. Go back. I don't even want to say how far back because it makes us look too old, Pierre. But Pierre LeBrun, who does excellent work for the Athletic in the United States and I guess all over the world, and TSN in Toronto, the Sports Network. I always laughed when they started the TSN because they actually used the T is for the word the. Not many acronyms do that, but the Sports Network, TSN. Anyway, Pierre, thanks for coming in and doing this for us and giving us your insights. Appreciate it.
By the way, Neil, it's an honor to be on here. Somewhere in the TSN halls is still a framed picture of Gino Retta's mustache, which is a legendary thing on its own, like the mustache. Gino himself is a great broadcaster, but his mustache is famous.
Oh, yeah.
Doesn't have one anymore. So that was that era, right?
Yeah. Movember. Didn't he always bring it up in Movember?
Yes.
And it was so thick. I mean, if you wanted to have a mustache, Lanny McDonald's probably the only one that wouldn't be an envy of it, right? So, Pierre, tell me, before we get going on individual things, in your life, are you more busy during the season or during the off season?
Yeah, I would say that like the next 10 days is probably, if not the busiest, right there into the 10 days leading into trade deadline in March. So they're right sort of near each other as the 2 busiest periods of the year. Obviously, I was on the road a ton for the playoffs, but that's more traditional reporting where I'm, writing columns on off days and off games and that stuff's all great. But the business of the game, as you know, is what I've made my career more about over the last 30 years. And we're in the thick of it right now. That's for sure. But the beauty of it is that once July 2nd comes, I hang them up and go hang out on my lake, and I don't care what else happens the rest of the summer. I hope there are 20 trades after I go on vacation.
Yeah, that's great. I'll come with you if you want. I'm down here sweating it out in South Carolina. I want to go in a different direction than we had in the rundown, just because I just thought of this and how important it is. So last year I'm at the draft. I'm told by all these manager friends of mine that like the tampering is just crazy. The 30 teams that aren't in the final have such an advantage now over the 2 teams that are in the final because they get the jump on everybody. And as you don't make the playoffs, you get the biggest jump. And then if you get eliminated after the first round, you have another jump. And having done the job myself and knowing what goes on in the league and stuff, how are they ever going to stop tampering? Because obviously there's a million different ways to do it. Mm-hmm. And I know Bill Daley came out with something, to warn people, don't sign players on, July 1st at 12:01, or else we're going to know that you couldn't get it done in 1 minute. But do you expect them to sign again right at the crack of noon? Will they ever be able to get their arms around it?
No, and like a GM recently told me, if you're not trying to do your legwork ahead of July 1st, then you're going to be left standing getting nothing done on July 1st. Like, let's be real. There has to be tampering because you don't want to be the one team that doesn't do it, and then you're not ready. And the hard thing for teams to control is that it's really the agents that are at the heart of it. And there's obviously ways to do it that it's not as obvious, but at the end of the day, you're an agent and you have 10 clients, and then you have one, the origins of your call may not have been about the one client at the end that you get in there to make sure, but that's what happens on these calls. And by the way, do you have a need on your blue line? Wink, wink. And that's how the conversations play out. I think I understand why the league had to do what they did this year when Bill Daly warned all the teams. I mean, I think, to be honest, like Steven Stamkos, who's one of the awesome guys in the league, and he came on our air on TSN on July 1st. You may have done the same with Sportsnet, but he came on our air after he signed with Nashville and talked about the process. And listen, I feel bad for him because it was clear, I guess, in his comments that, his reps have been talking to Nashville for a couple of weeks when, of course, they weren't supposed to. But that's what everyone's doing. But I think that was one of the examples of the league going, come on, But I think it's all of it is silly. There used to be a legal tampering window in the CBA that got kiboshed in the COVID 2020 CBA extension very quietly under the radar. But until 2020, there was a UFA speaking period in late June in the days leading up to July 1st, where it was legal for teams and agents to talk. And it was the PA, strangely enough, that asked the league to eliminate it when they did that June 2020 extension. Was it 20 or 21? Anyway, whenever they did that CBA extension, they got rid of the UFA speaking period. And I think the PA, if I recall at the time, just felt that they actually want the market to breathe on July 1st, and they don't want the teams to know everything that's going on. But of course, it changed nothing because those conversations are still happening anyway. They're just not legal. And so I don't know. I think the whole thing is silly. You can't wait till July 1st to pick up a phone and phone someone about a player, because if you're doing that, you're 25th in line by then.
The thing is that the folks out there listening to this wouldn't understand is it's probably not the general manager that's talking before always directly to the agent. There's an intermediaries on both sides that are checking things out. And you'd be stupid if you were the GM to actually pick up the phone and call Don Meehan or Pat Brisson and blatantly say, would your player come to my team?
Yeah. I mean, there's all kinds of different ways to do it, really. But I mean, not to mention the fact that players talk to players around the league. That's one of the greatest weapons, because there are no rules about players. I mean, it's, players talk to players, and there's lots of word of mouth that gets around that way. So anyway, I understand where the league's coming from, but the reality is I think if everyone was smart about this, they would bring back the UFA legal speaking period ahead of July 1st.
Could you see that being part of the next CBA?
I haven't asked about that. I had a tweet this morning here on Monday that, they're inching closer to a CBA extension, but there's still a couple of outstanding issues still on the table, I was told this morning by a league source. In a perfect world, the league would have a tentative framework to bring to owners Wednesday in LA. There's a Board of Governors meeting Wednesday in Los Angeles. And that was always the target date, hoping that they would have a tentative framework for owners to vote on. But as of today, that might be pushing it, because there's still a few issues I was told that the PA and the league are trying to iron out. So, which is no one should be fearful of that. I mean, they're getting the CBA done certainly in the next week or two, I think, if not certainly in the next month.
Let's go back to what we've seen taking place since the final ended. There have been some RFA signings, some UFA signings, a few trades. What has intrigued you to this point since the Panthers raised the Stanley Cup last Tuesday?
So let me start with the 10,000 feet above thought that I've gotten from a lot of teams, which is, I'm intrigued to know what Neil thinks of this. But this is an offseason shaping up to be like no other that I can recall, or at least not for a long time. There are a lot of buyers and almost no sellers. And it's a strange cycle of events here. And what's happened is the teams that have been selling the last few years have almost nothing else to sell, and also want to get better. So Chicago trades for Andre Burakovsky over the weekend. They're wanting to add. San Jose doesn't have any more pieces to sell. They're looking to add. All these teams, Detroit desperately wants to get into the playoff picture. Buffalo wants to get better. Yeah, Buffalo may trade some pieces, but it's not as a seller. Buffalo, if they trade Byram or Peterka, they're trying to get other pieces back that makes them better next year. Yeah. So one of the, I don't want to say complaints, but one of the observations I've gotten from managers across the league in the last 2 weeks is they can't believe how many buyers there are, but few sellers. Everyone's looking to add a piece or two. Yeah. Well, the math is difficult on that if everyone's looking to add. So I think because of that, the reason I wanted to start there is because of that. While the focus every year traditionally is on the next 10 days between now and July 2nd, let's say, where a lot of teams get a lot of their work done, this is the kind of summer where a lot of teams will not be where they need to be on the morning of July 2nd. And will need the rest of the summer to continue to work the phones to get what they need done and finesse. And I think finesse a trade a lot more than they would have in years past. And so I think this is the summer where we're going to have more August trades than we're used to seeing in the so-called dead time of the offseason, because I think that the next 10 days won't be good enough for some teams to get done what they need to get done.
What about in draft picks? That might, is that a currency that's going to be used? Because I get exactly what you're saying, and I can't even think of a team.
Well,
even
Pittsburgh's
Anaheim.
Pittsburgh's selling, but other than Brian Rust, there's not a lot to poke away at there. I mean, Anaheim's a great example. They've already done some buying, trading for Chris Kreider. Anaheim wants to add. They're not selling. So all these teams that are trying to get over the hump, they're different versions of the hump. You know, Detroit and Anaheim want to get in. The elite contenders want to add big. Philadelphia, Montreal, Calgary, Vancouver, all looking for a number 2 center. Good luck. So it's all these teams that have been in different places in the standings, but they all want to add to the group and not take away. It makes for an odd market because usually one hand feeds the other in the offseason, where you have teams looking to divest themselves of veteran players or contracts if they're retooling or rebuilding. There aren't that many teams doing that. So I think what it's going to take is 2 teams that can help each other, that are both looking to add, but may have pieces that fit better. So I'll give you an example. You know, JJ Peterka's name is out there a lot because I think he wants a change of scenery. 23-year-old forward, very talented. Is there something there with Calgary and Buffalo where, you know, Rasmus Andersson looks like he won't extend in Calgary? So is there Andersson for Peterka? I don't know. That's an example of 2 teams that are both looking to add, both looking to get better, that may have to find different pieces to make it work.
As we head towards July 1st, and you've mentioned so many teams thus far, but are there 3 or so on your list, either through free agency, trade, that you are earmarking in particular?
So I'm fascinated by the Dallas Stars. For my money, they're the best run team in the league. Well, I guess next to Florida. But you know, Jim Neil, 2-time GM of the Year award, and players are clamoring to either stay there or get to Dallas. So Matt Duchene signs $4.5 million a year. He would have got $6 to $6.5 million a year next week on the open market, but he wants to stay in Dallas and be part of things. I hear Dallas is high on Mitch Marner's list, except that Dallas has no cap room. Yeah. So, you know, Dallas is listening on Jason Robertson. That doesn't mean they're going to trade him. I think they're just listening because they want to make sure that they understand what his value is out there in the event they can't extend him. He's got a year left on his deal. And I think those preliminary contract talks this summer with his camp are very, very important, what ends up happening with Jason Robertson. But I guess it's a long way of saying, and I think Dallas wants to add a right shot D. They're in the middle of everything again, Jim Neil and the Dallas Stars. So there's certainly a team that I would keep an eye on. I think Buffalo, like I said, they're in a million conversations. So much pressure there to finally take that step. They have a lot of talent there. So it's just about figuring out how all the pieces can fit. And Kevin Adams, the GM there, is in a lot of different trade conversations right now. So that's definitely a team to watch here over the next 10 days.
Going back to Dallas for a second, you sparked a thought in my mind. Jim Neil is a friend of mine, and we've had him on here before, and I think he does an excellent job, too, with the Dallas Stars. I think we were all surprised when Pete DeBoer got fired, but we were even more surprised when he pulled Ottinger in that last game. than we were that he got fired. I'm not going to ask you if that was the reason that Jim did that, but I will say this to you, and I don't know what your thoughts are. Do you think some teams regret hiring a head coach early and not having waited a little bit longer because now all of a sudden Pete DeBoer's out there? I was joking with Vic on the phone this morning saying, we said that only the Dallas Stars don't have a head coach, right? And I said, you know who they should hire? Peter DeBoer. He's the best guy out there. And then I said, like Seattle jumped to get Lane Lambert. I like Lane. I drafted him for Detroit. He's a fine guy. But I mean, I don't know. Peter DeBoer's available. Are you still going to go for Lane Lambert? No put down to Lane Lambert. Just a acknowledgement of the record of Peter DeBoer and his time in the league.
Yeah. Pete DeBoer is number one on the free agent list, except there's no coach openings outside of the place he just got fired. I mean, Pete DeBoer will dominate the speculation next fall as soon as a team starts the year 0-5. I mean, he's guaranteed to be the pick of the crop, the next coaching carousel. I don't think it's a bad thing for him to have some time here to decompress. I believe he's coached 17 straight years. That's a demanding job, and I actually think once in a while it's good for these big name coaches to have a little time from a mental perspective to reset. And I think that'll be healthy for him, but he'll be in such demand next year as soon as there's some teams that are in trouble. Although interesting to point out that he remains involved in that he's part of the Canada's Olympic coaching staff. And I know they're having meetings this week. So it's interesting. If you're going to have a year where you start without a job, that's not a bad thing for Pete DeBoer, that he'll be pretty handy for John Cooper to keep an eye on things as Canada gets ready for the Milan Olympics as part of that coaching staff. I don't know. Seattle's, I guess, a good example there. I think most teams ended up with who they wanted, though. I mean, you think of Mike Sullivan, Joel Quenneville, some pretty big names who landed. So I don't know. A lot of those teams would have certainly at least would have wanted to interview Pete DeBoer, though, when you look at all the changes this summer.
Does Dallas go big name?
So my interpretation of what's happening there is that I think they want to get someone that they can have a real long-term relationship with. And so either that's a young guy waiting for his first chance, like a Neil Graham, who's their AHL head coach, who might be ready for promotion. He's a serious candidate for Dallas. Or is it a guy waiting for a second chance in Glenn Gulutzan, who, ironically enough, one of the first things Jim Neil did when he took over as GM more than a decade ago was fire Glenn Gulutzan as Dallas head coach. But I know the Stars really think highly of Glenn Gulutzan. And I think one of the reasons they think highly of him is that when you speak to Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl over the years about their relationship with their power play coach, Glenn Gulutzan, they speak very highly of him. And I think the appeal there, and I know that the Stars plan to interview Glenn Gulutzan, is that he's one of those modern coaches that has a relationship with core players. And that's something that appeals a lot to, I think, to Dallas. So we'll see where that goes. I mean, is it Graham? Is it Gulutzan? Is it someone else? But I think they want to go more in the same way that Dallas gave Jim Montgomery his first NHL head coaching job. I think they want to go somewhere either in that mold or in the 2.0 mold, like a Glenn Gulutzan.
Do you think Jerry Gallant will resurface? Because his record is very good. And I know I've talked to the managers that he's coached for, and I understand why he, except for New York, I understand why he left those teams. But do you think he'll get another chance?
I was certainly hoping that he would have been more involved in this offseason's carousel, but it doesn't sound like he got a lot of interviews. I think it's too bad. If you look at his record, to your point, Neil, all he does is win everywhere he goes. I mean, he's a constant winner. Yeah. I think the label, and I think it's somewhat unfair, is that he's not into analytics that much. But, man, the guy has such a feel for his bench and his players. The players always want to go through a wall for him. You know, he's in his 60s now, sure, but I would have liked for him to get one last crack, but, it didn't happen this summer for him.
Yeah, he's definitely a player's coach. He definitely is one of the guys that comes in and the first year or two gets almost a Roger Nielsen type thing. Like he gets the players to play for him. But then I guess what some people think is once you get past that, the technical stuff of the game isn't there. And it's sort of unfair, though, because, I mean, he took the Vegas Golden Knights as an expansion team all the way to the final.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Yeah. And success and everywhere he's been, really. And I guess, I understand that label you just talked about. But once you put your staff together and have different assistant coaches with different strength, there's always ways around all that stuff. I don't know. I think Gallant should have gotten another look here this summer, but it didn't happen.
One of the places Gallant was at one time was in Florida, where the two-time defending champs now have an offseason of decisions. And Bill Zito has been informed by both Sam Bennett and Brad Marchand that they want to stay in Florida. Any update on either, both, neither, stay in South Florida?
Yeah, so that whole thing has been fascinating to follow. I mean, Sam Bennett has been very clear in his updates, his beer-infused updates to the public. What his intentions are, and I think what he's saying is genuine. I spoke to him after they won the Cup. I was on the ice interviewing players, and he talked about how his teammates in Florida, he considers them his brothers, that this is the happiest he's been in his life, in his career. So all that is honest and true. I think the gray area that he can't get into is that what's a number that works for everyone there? And the reality is that the number in Florida is vastly different from the number he can get next Tuesday on the open market. He has an agent in Darren Ferris, who's also Mitch Marner's agent, that likes to bring his clients to July 1st if they're up for that. He believes in that strongly. He believes in the leverage that creates and being able to maximize, the leverage for his clients. So what I would tell you is that if Sam Bennett wants to stay in Florida, then he has to step in himself and tell his agent he's taking less, because there's only so much Florida can give him. And never mind the actual salary cap. And Florida's also trying to keep Ekblad and to some degree Brad Marchand, although I think Brad Marchand is probably going to market. But not just the cap itself, but the internal dynamics of the way they've set up their payroll there in Florida, where Barkov's at 10, Bobrovsky's at 10, Reinhart's at 8. I don't know that you can get over 8. I don't know that Florida can see Bennett above Reinhart, who scored 57 goals, 2 years ago, another 39 this year as a Selke Trophy guy. I think they probably see Reinhart and Bennett pretty evenly. So I think 8's the max that you can do salary-wise in Florida, whereas I think he legitimately could get $10 million a year on the open market. So now in Florida, it's times 8 years. On the open market, it's times 7 years, unless there's a sign and trade. It really comes down to the player. If he really, really wants to stay in Florida, then he has to know that it's for less money than what he can get elsewhere.
And to your point, Florida has 7 UFAs and $19 million of cap space, so he really does have to work with the club in order to make this work, so other players can get paid and they can keep this core intact.
Yeah, and he's a really important player. Like he's the number one priority, I think, for Bill Zito, the GM. But again, I don't know that there's not a world in which he can get paid the same as Alexander Barkov on that team. So what's that number that makes it work that he doesn't leave?
Pierre, one of the things that's fascinated me this season, and I mentioned it to some people that work with the Leafs, is the lack of, there's outrage in Toronto all the time about everything, But the one thing there was an outrage. I know, and I'm a Torontonian right there with you, but the one thing that there wasn't outrage about, which I was always worried about as a manager in a big market, is how do you let Mitch Marner get to free agency? How do you allow that to happen? Now, you and I might be able to explain that because we know what's going on behind the scenes there. But you would have thought that the fans would have been like, you can't lose Mitch Marner for nothing. That's a cardinal sin with a management, is to lose a great player. Like the Islanders losing Tavares was a cardinal sin. And that gets you fired. You lose guys like that, you don't keep your job very long.
Yeah, so I think, listen, excellent question, especially for, people listening and watching this that obviously don't follow the Leafs every day. The answer is that Leaf fans are pretty well educated in the nuances of all this, and they know that the window that was missed, and there was outrage at the time, was that the summer when Kyle Dubas was fired and Brad Treliving was hired to replace him as GM here in Toronto. Brad Treliving took the GM job with about 5 weeks to go before July 1st that summer, 2 years ago. And that was the July 1st where Mitch Marner's modified no trade became a 100% no move. So the offseason to have perhaps gone out and done something with Mitch Marner in terms of getting assets for him was 2 years ago, not this year. Because once Mitch Marner got the hammer, he used it. Because at this past trade deadline, as it was revealed, the Leafs had serious trade discussions with Carolina. They had something in place to move Marner to Carolina if he signed off on it. And Marner said, no, I'm not waiving, which is his right, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
But to answer your question, the reason there's not as much outrage now is I think Leaf fans who are well-educated understood that the window was back in the summer of 23 where the Leafs had to have done something if they wanted to get assets for him. And honestly, at the time, I think it was probably split among Leaf fans who by then felt that the core four needed to be shaken up. And so I'm just being rudimentary here, but probably half of the fan base would have been happy to see a Marner trade 2 years ago before July 1st. But the other half thought it was nuts and knew how talented he was and were relieved that July 1st came and went without him getting dealt. But once that happened, whether you're pro Marner or against Marner, Leaf fans understood that once that happened 2 years ago, this was always going to be up to Marner how this played out. And I think it's been clear since last summer that Darren Ferris, in his communication with the Leafs, literally foreshadowed all this and said, well, let's just play out the year and see what happens. That was code for we're bringing ourselves to market, and that's what's happening.
Right. And I get that. And then on the John Tavares piece of the team, he had in my mind, again, I wasn't in the building like you were, but I mean, I thought he had a fantastic year and showed so much character in the way he handled the C being removed and going over and was part of that and embraced it. And then on top of it, I never heard one time about any sulking or anything.
Yeah.
Like, this is a guy you want in your locker room. What do you think will happen there?
And they want him back. And there have been multiple conversations about what that looks like. But as of Saturday night, the last time I checked in on it, both sides were still apart. And it's incredibly interesting because, he's up there in age now, but he just had a 38-goal campaign, 74 points as a number 2 center. How do you replace that on top of losing Marner? On the other hand, because of his age and because of the fact the Leafs want to maximize their cap space to do different things on the trade market, I get why the Leafs are trying to bring him down on his AAV to a number that. And so what's interesting is that there are always two tenable arguments to be made in a conversation like this. Matt Duchene just signed for $4.5 million a year. The Leafs for sure would look at that and say, see, there's a bargain. There's a guy wanting to stay and be part of things. Why can't we get something around $5 million for John to stay here? But then Brock Nelson just signed for $7 million a year. And I'm sure Pat Brisson, the age of John Tavares, is like, John Tavares' numbers are way better than Brock Nelson last year. And so $7 million there, 4.5 there. What's the sweet spot in the middle? And that's where that conversation is at right now. I think ultimately it gets done, but I get why it's not easy sometimes finding that sweet spot.
Yeah, and Pat's really good about doing for his players whatever they want. If i.e. Sidney Crosby taking a hometown discount to stay in Pittsburgh, and I would imagine if John Tavares still is thinking about that picture of him in his Maple Leafs pajamas when he was 8 years old, he'll take a hometown discount there. Do you know anything, Pierre, about that lawsuit in Canada that the Revenue Canada was trying to get him to have to pay tax on that signing bonus?
Yeah, I saw there was an update the other day, but I'm not well versed in.
Okay,
I'm not an accountant by night.
No, but I just bring it up because it's that would change a lot of things and really hurt the Canadian clubs if Revenue Canada wins that, right? Because signing bonuses would be counted as what they should be counted as compensation, because that's what they are.
Yeah, that case is a little more complicated too. The argument for Tavares' side was that he was still in New York when he signed that on his way to Toronto, if that makes any sense.
Okay,
So, there's, complicated.
Something else that is going to be top of mind throughout the summer, even though it really isn't a story until next summer. And that, of course, is Connor McDavid's contract, which will be expiring at the end of next season. And Stan Bowman has said he's going to let McDavid drive the talks. They already have Leon Draisaitl tied up until 2023. So where do you see this ending? And Neil and I spoke about it last week, that is McDavid the type where he's going to want to finish the business that has been started in Edmonton and they've gotten so close the last couple of years? Or is he going to take his act elsewhere to someplace that he may be able to win in a place that's not called Edmonton?
Yeah, so I thought McDavid was very honest in his comments at the news conference last week, like pretty to the point, if you really listen attentively to the way he put things. But I think what's happening is he wants to decompress here a bit for a few weeks and examine what the Oilers front office is going to do before ultimately jumping in to the next phase of that conversation. So the first phase of the conversation will be McDavid and his agent, Judd Moldaver, talking to the Oilers front office over the next few weeks about why the Oilers feel they're still a contender and the moves they've made here in the next couple of weeks and why they're still in it. And that's an important discussion because McDavid, as he stressed last week, it's all about winning. He needs to know that this is still a team that's going to knock at the door. So that's the first level of it. They're not even going to get into the contract in that first conversation. First conversation is, where are we headed? If he's satisfied with that first layer of that conversation, then round two is the math. What does an extension look like if he decides to extend, which I think ultimately he will, but it's not 100%. And I think people have to be ready for a lot of different outcomes here. If he does extend, I don't think he's doing 8 years. I think he's going to go shorter. Mm-hmm. What shorter looks like, 3 years, 4 years, I don't know. But I think, John Moldaver is the agent who did a 4-year extension for Auston Matthews that grabbed a lot of people's attention 2 summers ago. Yeah. Because we're so used to in hockey, those players sign for 8 years. And Moldaver is like, no, Austin's good with 4. I could see something similar in nature for McDavid in a sense that it would allow him to continue to take swings at a cup in Edmonton while not necessarily marrying himself to the rest of his career there. So it could be a good little hybrid compromise potentially. So that's where I view that situation out right now.
Is anybody going to pay the modern day Reed Larson that plays for Edmonton? Is anybody going to pay Bouchard $10 million?
Good retro reference there. Yeah, he's quite a dynamic offensive defenseman. I don't know where that's headed exactly. That one's been a tougher nut to crack, in terms of whether or not there'll be an offer sheet. The player has to be a willing participant. I think the most underappreciated part of the offer sheet discussion is that, people just throw out names and say, what about offer sheet for him or him? The player has to mentally be bought into the process, which is counterintuitive to the normal hockey player DNA, to turn your back on your team. And even though in theory you want the team to match and you want to stay there, there's not a lot of players in the history of the game that have been comfortable going down that road. Because I think it really has to be explained to the player that, hey, maybe they won't match. Yeah. He may be leaving. So, I don't know where Bouchard falls and all that, but it's obviously a huge priority for the Oilers I was talking to a source yesterday that they'd like to get him done by next week before July 1st, just to eliminate the offer sheet possibility.
But would the Oilers once again be vulnerable the way they were last year? They lost Holloway, they lost Broberg to St. Louis. They've got less than $12 million in cap space. They've got a lot of UFAs, including, and Neil and I had mentioned this early in the show, that the Trent Frederick deal appeared to be done. And yet it's not being posted anywhere on either Sport Track or Puckpedia. So that would take more money out of this. And so circling back, are the Oilers more vulnerable because they're so low in cap money?
But vulnerable for who? Bouchard?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's why they want to sign him by next week. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
fair. They want to. That's the fast track conversation right now is between the Oilers and Bouchard's camp. The next.
But back to Neil's question though, how much of that cap is he going to eat into? Because there's not going to be a lot left on the bone at that point.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and I don't know the answer. It's nice, by the way, 30 years into this, where I can just say, you know what, I don't know. It's not something media are comfortable saying, I think.
Yeah.
But I find even myself saying lots of times, I don't know. I don't know. It has all changed. It's not as predictable as it used to be. There's so many different variables in it. And you've really enlightened us and the viewers, listeners to a lot of it. It's fascinating. We could take you all day long, but I know you're well in demand and you've got your own work to do yourself. And thank you for doing this, Pierre. I really do appreciate it. It's great to see you and it's great to hear your insights, and we'll keep reading your stuff.
All good. It was great to do it, Neil. You're always very good to me when I broke into the business, and you were one of the deans of the business, and you were very kind and polite, and I don't forget things like that. So, well,
I appreciate that.
I say no to a lot of these, but I couldn't say no to you.
Well, you're Canadians. We're polite. We're very polite. When you were speaking of, by the way, of offer sheets and the player has to buy in, Joe Sakic was just jumping through my head back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. That was a whole different case. I think he knew that at the time the Avalanche and the Nuggets and everybody were pretty poor, pretty out of money. So that's probably why he was willing to do that with Don Bazley.
But that's a great example back in the day of, Joe being ready mentally to leave if you had to.
Yeah.
But that's the part of the exercise that, really dangerous for a player to ever believe that he's just doing it because he knows for sure his team will match. You never know that. You don't know that. So you got to understand what you're undertaking there.
I've already said goodbye, but I'm going to ask you one more question. Okay. Are more teams making money now than we know? For example, what I mean by that is I'm always telling Vic, that team's not making it. They're losing millions every year. I just know from my background that are there more teams making money? Because, man, these salaries and the money that we're talking about is huge.
Neil, the Ottawa Senators sold 2 years ago for $950 million US.
Yeah.
Do I need to say more? I'm not saying they're making money, but, day-to-day making money is one thing. And I agree. I mean, I think I don't know if the salary cap going up to $113 million in a couple of years is justified or not, but franchise valuation and franchise sales continue to skyrocket, not just in hockey, but around pro sports around the world. So I think it's like, regardless of what your day-to-day bottom line is, as an NHL owner that when your exit comes, you'll be taken care of. I mean, that honestly, what matters more than that.
Yeah, you've got it right. Thank you, Pierre, for doing this. It's been great. We hopefully we'll be able to call you back someday and you'll give us another favor.
We'll do it again next year at some point, for sure.
Okay.
Thank you, Pierre.
All right. See you guys.
Once again, it was our pleasure to have Pierre LeBrun from the Athletic and TSN on as our guest and chat about him a little bit more in a moment. Remember that our website is NHLWraparound.com, and NHL Wraparound, the show, will return next week as we do a draft and free agency recap. At least we're going to see who's been signed up to that point. It's kind of the opposite, Neil, of what we're doing today, where we're looking ahead, and by next week, we'll be somewhat looking back.
Yes, looking backwards after the July 1st big day and see how many players, as we talked to Pierre LeBrun about, how many teams are dumb enough to announce players signing at 2 minutes after 12.
I thought the point that he made about the CBA and that the NHLPA actually initiated to have the advanced discussions before the deadline, having had that taken out during COVID, I found was very interesting.
It is interesting. Even the way he explained it, I don't quite understand why the PA would want it taken out, but who knows? Anyways, it's something that the league would be better to have it in there, and then the talks would be legal rather than the league having to turn a blind eye to clearly what's going on out there.
And wouldn't you think that if you gave a week before the actual deadline to negotiate, that it would give the league leverage to say, okay, if you violate this, then you are going to forfeit draft picks or whatever?
I would think so. I mean, I think if they just say, okay, look, we got to do something to make this easier. But if you mess around with this, then you're really in trouble.
Yeah, I think that's my point exactly. So,
yeah.
I like your shirt today, once again.
As you said last week, I'm going to say it again. It's probably the most comfortable shirt I have, and I have a lot of shirts in my closet. But this Lougarou shirt has been great. Colin Mulvey, a friend of ours now, sent us some samples and put our logo on, and it's like you don't even feel like you're wearing it. And the thing that I like the most about it in this hot South Carolina summer is that if I start sweating in it, I don't have to panic that it's going to damage it at all. It doesn't. But everybody out there, I would seriously want you to go to lougarou.co. That's LOOGAROO.co and take a look at the merchandise and the apparel that they sell. And I'll put my name behind it. It's all good stuff, and it's all really comfortable stuff. And it's designed by a ex-pro hockey player, Colin Mulvey. So give it a look. LOOGAROO.co.
By the way, it's in the mid-90s here also, and I am much happier wearing off-white than you are wearing black, especially if we go outside after we record.
Yeah, because in the sun, I don't know if you know this, but black attracts the sun. White repels the sun. I don't know. Did you know that? Did you learn that in science class?
Yes, it's the same way you repel me on this show.
Oh, so therefore, you attract me.
That's right. NHL entry draft coming up Friday and Saturday at the Peacock Theater in Los Angeles. This event will have nowhere near the splash that it did a year ago when it was held at the Sphere in Vegas. And teams will be remaining at their headquarters to actually announce their picks. But the New York Islanders, with the first overall pick, they moved up 10 spots in the lottery, Neil. They had a 3.5% chance of winning the lottery. Indeed, they did. It is the fifth time in franchise history that they will have a number one overall pick. It was Billy Harris in 72, Dennis Potvin in 73, Rick DiPietro in 2000, and John Tavares in 2009. So big decision coming up for the new Islanders general manager.
Yeah, that is a big decision. I'm sure that their scouting staff has already knows which direction they're going on, which young player they're going to pick first overall. It's unfortunate that this is not a Connor McDavid type situation where they're going to get a generational player, but we don't know how good these young players will be in 2 to 3 to 4 years. And that's really when you're going to know whether they took the right guy.
So Matthew Darche has this decision in front of him. And like you said, the last 2 years we've had what people have referred to as generational players in that number one, with Connor Bedard going to Chicago in 2023, Macklin Celebrini to the Sharks last year. I think we could say at this point, maybe Celebrini a little bit ahead of Bedard in terms of development. But I'm intrigued with the first three players in North America for Central Scouting in terms of the ratings. And number one is Matthew Schaefer. And he comes from the Erie Otters. He's a defenseman. And I think one of the most intriguing pieces about him is how this young man has had to mature perhaps a lot faster than many of his peers. He lost his mom to cancer 16 months ago. Then the Billet family that he was staying with, the mother was hit by a train. People say that this was a suicide, actually. And then the owner of the Otters and a mentor to Schaefer, Mr. Waters, passed away from a heart attack during the World Junior Championships this past winter. And during that tournament, he broke his collarbone and had to miss the last 3 months of the season. So certainly a lot of things here that have made this young man grow up maybe faster than he would have under normal circumstances.
That's a ton of grief there with especially with his mom 16 months ago, the Billet family with that horrible situation there. Less grief when the owner of the team passes away, although it still would come as a shock. And then, of course, having the bad misfortune of breaking his collarbone. So I'm sure that'll all be taken into consideration by the Islanders and the teams that follow the Islanders as to whether or not to somehow hold that in his praise that, he's maturing fast, or do they say we don't want to take a chance that this could have psychologically have hurt him? Yeah. And I don't know which way anybody would go on that.
Also interesting are the number 2 and 3 ranked players. Michael Misa, who played with Saginaw of the OHL, 62 goals, 72 assists, 134 points. That's 10 more than the next closest player to capture the scoring title there. And then James Hagens, who's another center, comes out of Boston College, played in Hockey East, and grew up in Hauppauge, New York, which is not that far away from UBS Arena. So the question for you, Grandmaster, is where do you go here? Do you go for the defenseman, knowing that in the Islanders' history, this will be, as we mentioned, their 5th first overall pick of all time, but the only defenseman was Dennis Potvin. And that turned out pretty well for the Islanders. Or do you go for the scorer, or do you go for the hometown guy?
And I think at the end of the day, you go for the best player. And sometimes, Vic, it's also that you believe as a staff that the OHL is a better breeding ground than Hockey East, or conversely, you believe that Hockey East is a better breeding ground than the OHL. And both those two names, Schaefer and Misa, both played in the OHL. Hagens played in Hockey East, as you said. And there'll be some thought there as to which is a pure projection of what you're going to get. Is it going to be the way you played in Hockey East, or is it going to be the way you were able to play in the OHL? I would be surprised if the Islanders didn't go maybe for Misa, because when you say the situation with these three, I mean, leading the OHL in scoring by 10 points is a heck of a feat. I mean, it is a very, very competitive league. But we'll see. It'll be exciting for the Islanders and their fans, no matter who they get, knowing that they're going to get, obviously, an excellent, excellent prospect.
And the big scorer certainly brings to mind Mike Bossy when Bill Torrey drafted him, and there was concern about his defensive play. And
yeah, the story there is that it was Dwight Foster playing in Kitchener, and Mike Bossy playing in Laval. And the Islanders' Quebec scout was pushing, of course, for Mike Bossy because he saw him play every Monday night in Laval, because Laval played home games on Mondays. So Al Arbour was at the draft table, and he said, "Tell me about these two." And they described Dwight Foster, the all-round, coach's player, and then Mike Bossy, a pure goal scorer. And it was Al Arbour that said, draft the goal scorer. He says, "I can teach him how to check. I can't teach the checker how to score."
The rest is history with that one, right?
That's for sure.
Other players to look out for in this draft: 2 players from Djurgården in Sweden, leading the international list, Anton Frondell, who's a center, and Victor Eklund, a right wing. The top North American goalies, Joshua Ravensbergen, Lucas Beckman, and Michael Pradel, and the top international goalie, Pyotr Andrianov. So there you have a list of players to look out for.
It'll be an exciting day, although it'll miss the whole league being in one place at one time. That'll be interesting when they do it for the first time ever. The entry draft not having all the scouts and teams at it.
Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about what the draft was in the early days and then certainly back in your day when you were drafted by the New York Islanders. But just want to round out this section talking about the rest of the draft order. We're going to just go 1 through 10. As we said, the Islanders were first. San Jose dropped to second. Chicago dropped from second to third. Utah also had a big jump. They started the lottery in the 14 hole. They end up at number 4. Nashville will pick 5th. They have 3 picks in the opening round. They will also pick at 23 and 26. And then rounding out the top 10, Philadelphia at 6, Boston at 7, Seattle at 8, Buffalo at 9, and Anaheim at 10. And Neil, some news to report. We had Pat Verbeek on a week ago on NHL Wraparound, and one of the topics was the play of Trevor Zegras and how he potentially fit into the Ducks' longer-term plans, given that he appeared to be a more engaged player after his injury a year ago. But now he is a Duck no more.
No, but he is still flying because he's going to the Philadelphia Flyers for Ryan Poehling and Columbus's second-round pick this year, which was owned by the Flyers, and then Philadelphia's own 4th-round pick in the 26th draft. So they get Ryan Poehling and pick number 45 in this year's draft, and Trevor Zegras moves closer to his home of Connecticut.
So this is the second significant deal pulled off between the Ducks and the Flyers in the past year or so, with Jamie Drysdale coming to Philadelphia in exchange for Cutter Gauthier.
Yeah, that one was done. As you said, we talked about that one where Gauthier didn't want to play for the Flyers and ended up getting traded for Jamie Drysdale. And now Trevor Zegras joins his old buddy from the Ducks, and they'll play together. It's going to be very interesting to see Zegras on the Flyers when you think of who they've got with Mitch being so talented and a brand new coach, and of course, in Rick Tocchet coming in. It's really interesting when you get Trevor Zegras out of Anaheim. Is he going to be the same player that we saw in Anaheim, or will his game change now that he's older and he's more mature? And how will he fit into the Flyers type of hockey?
And I think for the Ducks, getting Poehling, getting 2 picks out of this also, Verbeek continues to build this club forward. And I would even go out on a limb now. I think they are close to being a playoff team in the 25-26 season.
I think they're going to be a contender for the wild card.
Yes.
That's what I think. I think that's what Pat Verbeek's goal is to try to get in. But there's a lot of teams, and Pierre LeBrun was talking about this when he said that there's not a lot of sellers out there. Mm-hmm. And I was going to say to him, it's sort of an analogy might be the real estate market, where you have a lot of people wanting to move to an area and there's no inventory. And that's sort of what you've got in the NHL right now. Teams wanting to add players, but there's not a lot of inventory of players out there that are going to get moved. So Pat Verbeek continues to improve. There's a lot of teams, though, that want to make that next step next year. The Detroit Red Wings, badly. Columbus Blue Jackets, badly wanting to make it. Utah Mammoth, badly wanting to make that jump. And it's going to be competitive. And I've always thought, Vic, You don't only think about, okay, for us to get in, what have we got to do to get in the playoffs?
Yeah.
But you've also got to say, who are we going to replace in the playoffs? Who do we see ourselves? Who do we see that could slip? Because you're certainly not going to replace the Florida Panthers or the Toronto Maple Leafs or the Tampa Bay Lightning in the East. You know, Utah has to hope they can be next year's St. Louis, or Anaheim has to be next year's St. Louis and knock St. Louis back out of it again.
We shall see if this is the first trade domino to fall, although we've had other trades before, but will this prompt even more deals towards the deadline, or if this is just simply a one-off? Some other news that is taking place, another RFA signing, Mason Lohrei re-ups with the Bruins 2 years, $6.4 million in total. And he was an up-and-coming defenseman, and I think somebody that Don Sweeney wants to keep, at least in the short term, to see how his growth continues.
Yeah, and they've got to rebuild now. And it's going to be interesting as to where does Boston go from here? How active will they be on July 1st? Are they going to try to go right back to being a contender? Because Pasternak is not a kid. He's not a young kid, and he's their best player, and they would only have a certain window to be able to win with him in the lineup.
Other news, and as we know, injuries always come out at the end of every playoff round, and now that the final has concluded, Florida Panthers, and actually Paul Maurice had spoken about this during the post-game press conference on Tuesday, that Alexander Barkov played with a cut palm, suffered in game 1 of the final. He had 13 stitches, which came out twice, so he wound up having his hand just glued back together so he could finish the final. And if you noticed that as he was carrying the Stanley Cup around, that hand was wrapped. Sam Reinhart had a grade 2 MCL sprain, and that was on that hit by Sebastian Aho, game 2 of the Eastern Conference Final, which even now I think was a pretty lousy hit. Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, turns out, played the final with a broken hand. He is uncertain of when the injury occurred, but you remember that on off days, his participation in practices was spotty.
Yeah, no, it was. And there are often times when he was a game-time decision for the Oilers.
By the way, you know what else suffered a casualty?
No.
The Stanley Cup itself. The early celebration hours for the Panthers, the rim of the cup was somewhat fractured, and this, of course, brings to mind, what was it, in 2022 when Nick Obey-Kubel of the Avalanche did a toe pick, fell, and the cup was bent down right towards the bottom. So the top and the bottom have sustained some injury in the last couple of years. Of course, that 94 team in New York, there was a little bit of hijinks that went on, almost to the point that the league decided that the cup needed to be chaperoned full time. Can you explain yourself there?
Yeah, that was the last time that the Stanley Cup was taken unchaperoned. Now Phil Pritchard has a full-time job chaperoning the cup around, thanks to Stéphane Matteau, who had it in Quebec. God knows what went on, but when I got it, which was next, it had solder around the top of the cup, and that didn't go over well with the league. It didn't go over well with me. But anyway, that's why Phil Pritchard has a job as Stanley Cup chaperone.
And where was Eddie Olczyk in this pecking order here? Because I know that there was a Kentucky Derby winning horse that ate out of it.
Yeah, I don't know when that happened, but I know that did happen. I'm not sure. I'm not sure when that was.
Yeah, you didn't book the scheduling, did you, for that?
No, I wasn't doing that, no.
Two other items. Roman Josi, the captain of the Nashville Predators, been diagnosed with POTS. And POTS is the acronym for postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. And that is a condition that causes symptoms when you transition from lying down to getting up. You get dizziness, you get fatigue, you get a faster heart rate. It is a syndrome that has no cure, but can be treated. And the Predators are very pleased with the progress that Yossi has made, and he is expected back for the 2025-26 season. And he had not played since February 25th when he was hit by all players, Sam Bennett, in a game against Florida.
Yeah, well, thank goodness that he's going to be okay and that he's going to play. He's a terrific player, a guy that is such a good captain and such a good offensive defenseman for Nashville.
One other item, TJ Brodie, defenseman for Chicago, cleared unconditional waivers, bought out, has 1 year left on a contract that is worth $3.75 million for that last year.
And from what I hear, his wife is ill, and this has taken his mind, as it should, away from hockey. So the Blackhawks and Brodie decided to forego that last year of his contract, and he is being bought out.
Remember that I promised you that was the last item?
Yeah.
I just lied. The Hockey Hall of Fame class of 2025 will be announced Tuesday. Among the players that have the best chance to get in, Zdeno Chara, Joe Thornton, Duncan Keith, and Montreal goaltender Carey Price. This is the human side of the story, and the NHL Draft coming up at the end of the week. We have seen so many different iterations, from the first ever draft, which was held at the Queen Elizabeth Hotel in 1963, to what has evolved to the Sphere in 2024. There have been many different iterations of how this has been conducted. And certainly, Neil, you were part of them when you were selected by the Islanders back in the day.
Yeah, I was. And of course, back in the 1974, they called you to tell you you'd been drafted. They didn't have the players in attendance at the draft like is done today. And it was a much more calm situation in those days than it is now.
Where did you expect to go in the draft that year?
I didn't. I expected to go to the bathroom. I didn't think I'd be drafted.
When you found out it was the Islanders, and of course they drafted Billy Harris first overall in 72, Dennis Potvin in 73. You get selected in 74, albeit you weren't a first-round pick. But still, the thrill to have been drafted by an NHL team. Couldn't have been.
It was so exciting. And I was on the verge of leaving for Western Michigan University at that time. So to be the first player ever drafted from Western Michigan University was still something I still hold on there. The interesting part about the entry draft, Vic, is that until 1979, it was called the NHL Amateur Draft.
Right.
And then it's only been a public event since 1980. And I say only, you could say, well, that's 45 years. Yeah, 45 years, but it started in 63. And, of course, TSN and Canadian television has been putting it on over the air since 1984.
You had shared an interesting story with me off camera over the past week about how these announcements were made somewhat secretly, and pretty interesting story as to why.
Well, the WHA came into existence in 1972, and the National Hockey League Board of Governors was really worried about the rating that was going on of the NHL from the WHA. And a lot of the players that the New York Islanders took in their initial expansion draft were rated by the WHA, and that's why the New York Islanders had such a pathetic team that first year in 1972-73. The prize they got for being that bad was Dennis Potvin, which is a pretty good prize you get for having suffered through that season. Dennis, of course, being a perennial all-star and a Hall of Fame number one defenseman, and ended up being the captain of 4 straight Stanley Cups for the Islanders.
As you see number one picks get selected, now year after year, you're generational, you're not generational, has the pressure increased with the visibility and social media and just the entire dynamic of the way information is shared now, and it makes players, perhaps even bigger than life than they were, as per se, when Mario Lemieux was taken first overall in 1984. But was the pressure the same then, in your opinion, as it is now, with the spotlight as intense as it is?
I was at the Bedard draft, and it was insane what this 18-year-old kid was doing and being, carried around all over the place to do interviews, to do all this stuff. And he'd gone from being a junior player and living in a billet in Regina to now all of a sudden this household name. So I guess with that comes a lot of pressure, and particularly when you know that the first overall pick is going to a team that missed the playoffs in all likelihood. And this year it'll be the Islanders, although it won't be a Celebrini or a Bedard. But I don't know that there's the pressure that there used to be. There are more young players playing today than there ever were, because there's 32 teams. So I think that takes some of the pressure away. In the 21 team league, an 18-year-old rarely played on the team. Steve Yzerman, Mario Lemieux, of course, Wayne Gretzky started in the WHA. He played when he was 17, 18 in the NHL. His first year was 79-80. But I don't know that there's more pressure or less pressure now. I think that the teams down at the bottom of a 32-team league really want to improve, and they're hoping that this 18-year-old phenom helps them improve. But it's pretty tough to put that demand on an 18-year-old.
Do you find that the growth of a player is longer or shorter from when, say, 20 or 30 years ago? Because I think when we watch the coverage, and there tends to be always this wrap-up that, well, we're not going to know for another 4 to 5 years how good this draft class was. Is it the same as it always was, or do you think that maybe the years of growth that has slid a little bit in one direction or the other?
I still think it's going to take 3 to 4 years. You might need less time now to make that judgment than you needed, because there's 2 things that you got to take into consideration. One is that, as I've already said, you've gone from 21 teams for a long time. Now you've got 32. So you need young players in the league. And so there's going to be more, and then you're going to be able to make those comparisons earlier than you were able to when there was less teams. And the second thing to think about is that players in the 21-team league got paid for what they had already accomplished, so that if you scored 40 goals, you got a big payday on your next contract. It doesn't work that way anymore. Now, the young players are getting all the money, the phenoms, and the old veteran players, i.e. Corey Perry, i.e. Brad Marchand, as compared to the guys who they have to sign, who still have 10 years ahead of them. Those are the guys getting all the money. The guys with only a couple of years ahead of them aren't getting the money anymore. So people are getting paid for what they're projected to do, not for what they have already done. And that's a big difference between the era of the 90s and before as opposed to now.
And that next generation arrives at the NHL this coming weekend. That'll wrap up our show for today. Thanks to Pierre LeBrun from the Athletic and TSN for joining us. Thanks to UBS Financial Services, Inc. NHL Wraparound and UBS Financial Services, Inc. are not affiliated. UBS is a sponsor of three things you need to pay attention to. No other affiliation, relationship, or endorsement is made, suggested, intended, or should be implied or inferred between UBS and VNS Productions, LLC, or any of the individuals or businesses and or their respective products and services appearing in this program.
Thanks to our listeners. Send questions or comments to nhlwraparound@gmail.com or reach us individually at Neil@nhlwraparound.com or Vic@nhlwraparound.com. All podcast platforms that you can find have NHL Wraparound on them, including Apple Podcasts, Amazon, iHeartRadio, Spotify, YouTube. And take a look at our website, nhlwraparound.com, to find a full catalog of everything that we've been doing since January of 2024. There's a lot of good stuff on there. So subscribe, tell your friends to subscribe, your family, your mother, your sister, everybody. And check out some short clips that we've got on X, where we go by the handle of @NHL Wraparound. The next NHL Wraparound will be next week, as Vic said earlier, where we're going to recap the draft and the very early days of free agency.
I look forward to it, sir.
I do too. I always look forward to seeing you.
We'll see you then.
Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks for joining us on the NHL Wraparound Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date on all the NHL action.